Welcome to our video on human reproduction. We're going to take a look at the sex organs, look at the sex cells in them, the hormones that control them, look at the menstrual cycle, and then take a look at fertilization and development. Let's start by doing a quick little recap of sexual reproduction. This process involves a sperm cell combining with an egg cell, also called an ovum, by a process called fertilization, to create a zygote. This is the first body cell of a human, also referred to as a somatic cell. Ultimately, this is going to create variation, a unique offspring. This is done by a sperm cell, which is monoploid or haploid, meaning has half the DNA of the father, joining with an egg cell, which has half the DNA of the mother, also monoploid, and they combine by fertilization to create a diploid cell, meaning a cell that has 23 chromosomes from mom and 23 from dad. This cell has all the DNA, the diploid amount, to make a full-grown human. This cell is also unique. We're going to take a look at how do we go from this unique zygote to a full-grown human being. To start, we're going to take a look at the overview of the human reproductive cycle. First, you have your sperm combines with the egg by a process called fertilization to make that zygote, like we just saw, also called a somatic cell, your first body cell. That body cell, the somatic cell, the zygote, is going to divide by mitosis, as all body cells do. And it's going to divide by mitosis and create genetically identical cells. Those two cells, that's your whole body right now, are going to divide by mitosis to make a ball of cells called a morula. And guess what? They're all going to be identical, genetically identical cells. Those are going to divide by mitosis to make a little baby. All cells are identical. And that little baby is going to grow up by mitosis to make an adult human with all their cells genetically identical. But once this adult human hits a certain age, puberty, which could vary from people, once they hit puberty, then they start to do a different type of cell division called meiosis. That's when they make sperm, if they're a male, or they do meiosis if they're a female and make eggs. I have to draw your attention down here. All the cells in the human body have the same DNA. That's strange because last I checked, my liver does something different than my lung, and they both do something different than my pancreas. And all of them do something different than my skin. So how do different cells, if they're all genetically identical, how can they differ in structure and function? This is a Regents question from New York State. Pretty much it says, if all your cells have the same DNA, how do they become different and carry out different functions? It's been a big focus lately. Well, if they have the same instructions, the same book of ingredients and recipes, maybe the liver cell uses different pages or different parts of the instructions, and the lung cell uses other parts of the instructions, and the skin cells use other parts of the instructions. They all have the same book of instructions, but if you're trying to make brownies, you're not going to go on the page that says how to make pizza. So different cells, they're going to use different parts of the DNA, different genes, to carry out different functions and become structurally different. That's called cell differentiation. All right, we're going to take a look now at the male and female reproductive systems. We're going to start with the male. Here's a side view of the male reproductive system. We're going to look at where the sperm are made. They're going to be made here in the testis. The testi, this blue sphere, or the testicles, this is where the male hormone testosterone is made and secreted. It develops secondary male characteristics and also causes the sperm to be created, the male gamete. They're made in the testi by a process called meiosis, a special type of meiosis known as spermatogenesis. And the testes must be held away from the body because they have to be 2 to 3 degrees cooler. Therefore, they're located in the scrotum. It's a muscular sac of skin around the testes, and they're going to help keep the testes at their optimal temperature for sperm production. And the muscles of the scrotum, on a hot day, they're going to relax to take the testes farther away from the body, keep them cool. On a cold day, the muscles in the scrotum are going to contract, keeping the sperm closer to the body and close to their optimal temperature. While waiting to leave, the sperm will hang out in the epididymis. It's the area behind the testy. And the epididymis is where the sperm is stored and finish maturing. And once the penis is stimulated, number 11, then the sperm will leave. Let's see how that's done. The sperm will leave through this tube, the vas deferens. And as they move through the tube, they're eventually going to collect some liquids or fluids along the way. But some people have this tube cut or tied off. This is called a vasectomy. The tube is cut or tied off. Sperm can't leave the testy, and they'll just be destroyed or digested or broken down, and the materials will be reused. But let's say the sperm do leave. There's no vasectomy here. The sperm will travel, and they're going to start to collect fluid, first from this gland called the seminal vesicle. The seminal vesicle will release a basic nutrient-rich fluid to the sperm. Basic to counteract or neutralize the acid of the vagina to help the sperm survive. The sperm, now with fluid called semen. Semen is the mixture of sperm and fluid. That mixture of semen, or the semen, will move through another gland, this thing. This is known as the prostate gland. Right below the bladder in men, sometimes this gland can swell or become enlarged. It could block urine from leaving the bladder, which is right above it. And it is going to be checked through the rectum. We'll take a look in a second. But the prostate is going to add more fluid to the sperm, making the semen volume greater. And it also is going to add a push to the semen for ejaculation. And to check the rectum, or to check the prostate, doctors will go through the rectum. This thing right here, this is where solid waste is stored, eventually coming out the anus. Doctor will go in through the anus, palpate the walls of or touch the walls of the rectum, and feel if that prostate is enlarged. While this is all going on, or before the sperm even leave the testy, this little gland, the Cowper's gland, will add a mucus to the urethra. It will lubricate the urethra, getting it ready for the eventual release of the semen. 10 is the urethra. Once the urethra is all lubricated up, ejaculation can occur, and semen is ejaculated through the urethra out the penis. So the urethra actually is going to have two functions, a reproductive and an excretory. Reproductive because it's going to release semen in a process called ejaculation, and excretory because it will release urine. Taking a look at the frontal view of the male reproductive system, we'll start with the testes again. The male gonad, where sperm are made, and also testosterone. The sperm will hang out in this thing, the epididymis, until they're ready to leave. They're ready to leave when the penis is stimulated. The sperm will leave through this tube, the vas deferens. But if the vas deferens is cut, called a vasectomy, sperm can't leave. But let's say no vasectomy. Sperm are moving. They're going to move around or behind the bladder, where urine is stored. And as this is going on, or even before the sperm leave, the gland, the bulbourethral, known as the Cowper's gland, will release a mucus into the urethra, the tube through the penis, to lubricate it and get ready for the ejaculation of semen. The sperm will keep on moving and start getting liquids or fluids from the seminal vesicle and from the prostate. This fluid's basic to counteract the acidic vagina, and it also has nutrients. The prostate will add a push to the liquid to get it out. That is called ejaculation. All right, time for the female reproductive system. We're going to start by looking at the female gonad, which is this thing right here called the ovary. The ovary, this is in the side view on the right. On the front view on the left, that's the ovary right there, the female gonad. The ovary is connected to, there's a little bit of space between, but it is adjacent to, number 2, the oviduct. This is where the eggs will be released, and ultimately this is where fertilization will happen. That's the oviduct in the side view. This is it in the front view. Oviduct, also called the fallopian tube. Again, where fertilization happens in the first third of this tube. The oviduct or fallopian tube leads to this structure. Number 3, the uterus or the womb. This is where the baby will develop, and this is where the placenta will grow so the baby could be fed and get rid of its wastes. The uterus in the front view is right there. The uterus at the bottom has a little opening, very narrow opening here called the cervix. And this is the cervix in the front view. The cervix will lead to this thing, the vagina. This is the birth canal, and this is also where sperm are deposited, ultimately making their way through the uterus, through the oviduct, to meet up with the egg. And this is the vagina in the front view. The other organs and openings or orifices is right here. This is the rectum. And the opening is called the anus. That's where solid waste will come out. And the third orifice or opening leads to the bladder, where urine is stored. This is the urethra, where only urine comes out. Females' urethra has one function, the males have 2. Now let's take a look at the female reproductive cycle, called the menstrual cycle. We're going to look at the follicle stage, which is the first 14 days of this 28-day cycle. For that, we need to look at the female reproductive system. And let's start with this thing, the ovary. Let's blow it up and look a little deeper in the ovary. The ovary has many of these, the ovarian follicle. Inside the follicle contains the egg, right there, that little dot. In order for that egg to mature and finish meiosis, or oogenesis, the specific type of meiosis, we have to look at the brain for help. Of course, the brain. And a gland that's not part of the brain, but part of your endocrine system. That gland is the pituitary gland. It's going to release a hormone that's going to stimulate the follicle to develop the egg. And you guessed it, it is called follicle stimulating hormone, F.S.H. It's released to cause the egg to develop over the first 14 days. So the egg will slowly but surely develop. While this is going on, while the egg is getting ready for possible fertilization, the ovary itself is going to release its own hormone called estrogen. And the estrogen is going to cause the uterine lining to thicken and become vascularized, meaning it's going to become filled with blood vessels, especially capillaries. So now the uterus, where the baby grows, also called the womb, is going to be prepared. And again, this is prepared for possible pregnancy and the growth of the placenta and the fetus. And the uterus is where the baby and placenta will grow. So the uterus is ready, all thick. The egg is all developed. Now let's release this egg and get ready for a possible pregnancy. We have to look at the pituitary gland for help. It's going to release another hormone called LH. This is referred to as a luteinizing hormone, kind of like a lubricant. This is going to cause the egg to be released from the follicle and ultimately the ovary. This is called ovulation. Here's the egg being released. That's ovulation. Looking closely at the ovary, there's ovulation again. That egg is released into a tube called the fallopian tube, the oviduct that we looked at before. This is where the fertilization could happen, the union of the sperm and the egg, and it must happen in the first third of the oviduct in order to divide enough and become a hollow, sticky ball of cells. That old follicle, though, it looks like it kind of shriveled up and became a little yellow-bodied structure. This is going to last 14 days, and the old, yellow, crumbly-looking follicle is called the corpus luteum, which is going to come into big play in the next stage of the cycle. On to the third stage, called the luteal stage after the corpus luteum. This stage is going to be wait and see. Is pregnancy going to happen? For that, we need to take a closer look at the ovary again and the corpus luteum, because the ovary is going to release a new hormone, a fourth hormone called progesterone. This hormone is going to be released by the corpus luteum for the last 14 days of this cycle. It will keep the uterus thick and vascularized, getting ready for a possible growth of the placenta and baby. And this will also prevent any future ovulation. But if pregnancy does occur, the placenta will release progesterone for the remaining 9 months of the pregnancy. This is known as the gestation period, the full 9 months. And this is different for different species. Elephants is 18 months gestational period. And that egg will move along by peristalsis through the fallopian tube, and it's unfertilized. Fertilization did not happen. Let's see the final stage of this process. All right, in the final stage of this cycle, the menstruation period, this is going to end the cycle and it's going to start a new one if no fertilization occurred. The only thing that stops for menstruation, the ending of a cycle and the start of a new one, is pregnancy, temporarily, or menopause, which permanently stops this process. So after the corpus luteum has disappeared, there is no more progesterone coming. Therefore, the uterine lining will break down, the thickened lining breaks down, and it will be squeezed out the vagina, and that process is called menstruation. This marks the end of one cycle and the start of a new one. All the lining is squeezed out, and the unfertilized egg is released as well. This is the menstrual cycle from start to finish. Let's see option 2, if fertilization occurs. So let's see what happens if fertilization does take place. And this drawing is thanks to Olivia Garbutt. Shout out. So, to get pregnant, the uterine lining has to be thickened and vascularized. The egg has to be released thanks to LH. Once the egg's released, sperm can be deposited anywhere from day 12 to 15. And if sperm is deposited here in the vagina, they make that long journey all the way to the egg in the first third of the fallopian tube. The sperm will then unite with the egg by a process called fertilization, restores the diploid number, the 2n number of chromosomes. Remember, gametes or sex cells have half. The zygote, the first body cell, will have the full amount of chromosomes, 46 for humans. That's the zygote. And that zygote will start to undergo lots of division. And that division is mitosis, but a special type of mitosis called cleavage, where after each cell division, the cells get smaller and smaller since no new cytoplasm is added. Once you have that big ball of about 100 cells called the morula, it will start to hollow out and become a blastocyst, plural blastula. This is a hollow ball of cells, and it's a sticky ball of cells for a reason, because it's going to slam into the uterine lining and embed itself. This is called implantation. During implantation, the blastocyst will embed itself, and the placenta will begin to grow. This will release progesterone, keeping the uterine lining intact for the full 9 months. And it will also release a hormone called HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. This is the hormone that is detected in pregnancy tests and is only released by the placenta. Gastrulation will begin. This is when the cells in the blastula, little inner mass, will bend outward and form a gastrula with 3 embryonic layers. We're going to take a look at that right now. All right, so after implantation, let's examine that implanted blastula. We see it embeds. We see this growing placenta, which is going to be necessary for the nutrient waste and exchange between the mom and the fetus. We see this outer layer, which is going to be the amniotic sac, filled with amniotic fluid. That acts as a cushion to protect the baby. So the baby is doused in liquid, submerged. And we see this little bump inside the blastula, this little bending bump that's bending inward. That is the inner mass, and that's going to be the fetus. Let's look closer at this. Here we see the bending of the cells, that inner mass. That's called gastrulation. And gastrulation is when cells will differentiate or specialize. They're going to use different parts of the DNA to become different, forming 3 embryonic layers. Again, there's the gastrula, the whole mass that's bending. We see a hole that forms, and that's the first opening. The first orifice or hole in the human body is the anus, not the mouth. And since the anus is the first hole, we're known as deuterosomes, not proterosomes. This outer layer is called the ectoderm. This is where the outer parts and organs and tissues will grow. Things like skin, hair, nails, the nerves in our skin. Then we have the inner endoderm. This is where the innermost organs will form. Things like the heart, stomach, liver, intestines. And in between the outer and the inner, you have the mesoderm. M for middle. Things like muscles and bones, tissues and ligaments are all going to form here. Let's see this a little more advanced. So now we have the baby fully formed as a fetus, especially after 8 weeks. It has its amniotic sac. It has its placenta, the green, and all its blood vessels right next to mom's blood vessels, particularly the capillaries. You have the umbilical cord, which gets all the nutrients from the placenta to the baby, like a little highway. Let's see how the placenta actually works. We could see mom's blood is going to give nutrients, oxygen, glucose, everything to the baby. So when the mom breathes, she breathes oxygen for herself and for the baby. When she eats, gets nutrients and glucose for herself and for the baby. The baby, in return, gives mom carbon dioxide, a byproduct of making ATP. So when the mom exhales, she's exhaling CO2 from herself and from the baby. And the baby gives mom urea, which mom will urinate out. So she urinates for herself and for the baby. So the placenta gets nutrients from mom to the baby, and it gives mom the waste. So the baby gets rid of waste through the placenta and gets nutrients through the placenta, necessary to have for pregnancy. But the blood of the mom will never mix with the baby. Since the baby is 50% dad's DNA, the baby's technically a foreign object in the mom. Since the baby has 50% of dad's DNA, it could make dad's proteins, and it will. And the proteins made using dad's DNA won't be recognized by the mom's blood, particularly the white blood cells. Those proteins will be considered antigens, and mom's white blood cells will attack the baby and ultimately kill the baby. So mom's blood can never mix with the baby, or else the baby will be killed. Mom, she could drink alcohol, which is a terrible thing to do during pregnancy because alcohol is the number one cause of birth defects, undersized brains. It causes fetal alcohol syndrome, drastically causes negative changes in the baby's development. Same thing with toxins and drugs. They're going to cause stillbirths, missing organs, limbs, massive deformities. Doing drugs during pregnancy is the absolute worst thing you could probably do. And just in general, doing drugs or toxins, terrible thing to do. But that also includes medications, so mom has to be careful with what medications that she takes as well. If the mom smokes, that's going to cause less oxygen for her and the baby. The baby can't get oxygen, it's going to be undersized, underweight, because not enough oxygen means it can't make as much ATP. If the baby can't make as much ATP, it can't carry out its life functions like growth and will become smaller. The baby particularly is vulnerable in the early months of pregnancy, usually that first trimester, the first 3 months, because that's when the major organs are just starting to form. The baby's very fragile. It's just starting to form its brain and heart, the first two things that form. So early in pregnancy, major organs form, which makes the baby particularly vulnerable to any foreign bad substances that come into the body of the mom. And after the end of 9 months, the water will break, meaning all that amniotic fluid comes out. The baby will be birthed, and the placenta and umbilical cord will come out as well, followed by all the thickened lining of the uterus. Finally, taking a look at this picture, it looks like 2 eggs were released, 2 eggs were fertilized, and it looks like we have 2 blastula present. If 2 eggs are fertilized and made 2 zygotes, those 2 babies that will be born will be twins. They're going to be a special type of twin called fraternal twins. They'll be genetically different, but they'll be born together. One could be male, one could be female. They could both be females, but different females. They could both be males, but different males. You need 2 eggs for this to happen, and both eggs, each individual egg, must be fertilized by a different sperm. So you need 2 eggs total and 2 sperm total. In our second scenario, it looks like 1 egg popped out, 1 egg got fertilized, and it looks like it's dividing and dividing and dividing, and a chunk of cells broke off. That morula stage, that ball of cells, looks like a chunk of cells broke off, and now you have 2 identical chunks of cells. And that's going to form 2 blastula. 2 identical blastula that will grow and develop into 2 identical babies, genetically identical 100%. For this process of identical twins, you need 1 egg and 1 sperm. Those babies will be completely identical, but the environment can influence gene expression. If you have 2 identical babies, one is underfed, one is fed very well, one's going to grow taller than the other. The environment can influence how genes are expressed. There are many examples of this, particularly the Himalayan bunny. That's all for the reproductive system. Thank you for watching.